I kept my hands folded in my lap and my eyes lowered as the courtroom settled into a hush that felt heavier than sound. The bench creaked as the judge adjusted her seat. Papers rustled. Somewhere behind me, a chair scraped softly across the floor. I did not look up. I did not speak. I did not react. My husband leaned toward the woman seated beside him, his voice low but careless, the way people get when they think they've already won. "She can't even speak," he whispered, loud enough for me to hear. His breath carried the faint scent of confidence, the kind that comes from believing no one is going to stop you. His mistress let out a small laugh, sharp and amused. "Look at her," she murmured. "Nothing to say." A few people on his side smiled. One of his relatives shifted comfortably, arms crossed, eyes trained on me with something like pity, or maybe satisfaction. From where they sat, my silence looked like collapse, like surrender, like proof that everything they had said about me was true. I stayed still. The judge reached for the file on her desk. The sound of it opening was ordinary, almost gentle, but it cut through the room more cleanly than any voice. Page by page, she read. No commentary, no expression. The air grew tight as everyone waited for her to confirm what they believed was inevitable. They thought my silence meant I had nothing left. They were wrong. The courtroom itself was colder than I expected, all polished wood and hard lines, designed to make emotions feel out of place. I had been here before for other matters, other people's conflicts, but this time the weight of it pressed directly on my chest. Not because I was afraid, because I understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't a trial yet. It was a preliminary hearing, procedural on the surface, decisive underneath. Control, authority, the shape of the story that would be told from this point forward. Whoever walked out of this room with the narrative on their side would carry it everywhere else. My husband sat straight-backed, shoulders relaxed, as if this were just another meeting he planned to lead. His attorney leaned in occasionally, murmuring reassurances, tapping a pen against a legal pad with bored precision. They looked like men who expected efficiency, not resistance. The woman beside him crossed and uncrossed her legs slowly, her confidence practiced. She wore the expression of someone who believed she was already standing in the future she wanted. She didn't look at me again. She didn't need to. No one did. The silence around me took on a shape, something visible, something everyone else filled in for themselves. Weak, broken, finished. I let them. I had learned by then how eager people were to draw conclusions when you stopped correcting them. The attorney cleared his throat and began outlining their position, his voice smooth and reasonable. He spoke about cooperation, about practicality, about how I had chosen not to contest certain points. Each word stacked neatly on the next, building a picture of me as passive, uninvolved, irrelevant. I did not object. From the corner of my eye, I saw my husband glance at me, just once, a quick check to confirm I was still quiet. Satisfied, he looked back to the bench. He thought my silence belonged to him. The judge listened without interruption. She did not nod, she did not frown. She simply listened, pen moving occasionally, marking something only she could see. When the attorney finished, there was a brief pause. Too brief to be alarming, too long to be meaningless. She turned a page back. My husband missed it. The woman beside him noticed something shift, her smile faltering for half a second before she smoothed it away. His family leaned in, whispering among themselves, confident the delay was procedural, nothing more. When it was my turn, my attorney rose and submitted a small set of documents. No argument, no speech, just paper placed gently into the record. The kind of action that looks insignificant if you don't know what you're looking at. My husband's attorney barely glanced at it. The judge did. She read slowly this time. Then she read the same page again. The room felt different, though no one could have explained why. The confident energy thinned, replaced by something uncertain, like air leaking from a sealed space. My husband leaned forward, brow creasing. His attorney shifted in his seat, The woman beside him stopped moving entirely, her hands clenched together in her lap. The judge closed the file and removed her glasses. For the first time since I had entered the room, I lifted my eyes. I did not look at my husband. I did not look at the woman who had laughed. I looked straight ahead, steady and calm, as the silence settled again. But this time, it did not belong to me. The judge was about to speak when my mind slipped backward, the way it always does when everything hangs on a single moment. Before anyone heard that sentence, before the room tilted, there was a version of my life where silence wasn't strategy. It was trust. I met Daniel in a place that felt safe by design. It was a fundraising dinner for a regional arts foundation, the kind of event filled with polite applause and careful conversation. I had attended because one of my longtime clients was being honored, and Daniel was there because his family had donated one of the largest endowments. We were seated 2 chairs apart, strangers connected only by name cards and obligation. He wasn't charming in the obvious way. He didn't lean in too close or try to dominate the conversation. When I spoke, he listened. When I paused, he waited instead of filling the space. At the end of the night, he asked for my number with a small, almost hesitant smile, like someone who didn't expect to be refused but wouldn't be offended if he was. That restraint felt like safety to me then. We dated slowly. No whirlwind declarations, no dramatic gestures. We talked about work, about family, about the places we had grown up and the places we still felt tied to. Daniel came from a family that was known in quiet, respectable ways. They served on boards. Their names were etched into plaques and buildings, not splashed across headlines. Everything about them suggested stability. When he introduced me to them, they were polite and attentive. His mother complimented my work and asked thoughtful questions. His father shook my hand and told me it was good to meet someone so grounded. I noticed how often they looked to Daniel before responding, how decisions seemed to orbit around him, but I mistook that gravity for closeness. Our engagement was understated, announced over dinner with family rather than staged for spectacle. When we married, it felt like a partnership formed by mutual respect. We kept our finances largely separate. We supported each other's ambitions. I didn't shrink to fit his life, and he didn't ask me to, at least not at first. The first invisible line appeared quietly, the way they always do. It was a small decision about a joint appearance at an event tied to his family's interests. I had an opinion. Daniel's parents had another. He suggested, gently, that going along with them would keep things smooth. I agreed without much thought. Compromise seemed like maturity, not surrender. I remember the warmth that followed. His mother thanked me for being flexible. His father smiled in approval. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. I felt included, chosen, responsible for the peace I had helped preserve. That feeling became familiar. I brought something into the marriage that had nothing to do with money. It was my professional standing, my reputation for discretion, my ability to navigate rooms where influence mattered. My name carried weight in certain circles, and I had earned it carefully over years. It was mine, separate, intact. Daniel's family noticed. They asked questions that felt casual but weren't. Who introduced me to whom? How long I'd known certain people? Which doors I could open without asking? I answered openly, proud of what I had built, unaware that I was being assessed rather than admired. From the outside, our life looked balanced. Inside, something subtle shifted. Decisions began to be discussed without me and then presented as conclusions. Daniel never raised his voice. He framed everything as efficiency, as avoiding unnecessary friction. I trusted him. I trusted the pattern we had built. There was a moment, early on, when a friend asked why I hadn't been listed on a program for an event I had helped organize. I laughed it off and said it didn't matter. Daniel had said the same thing. Recognition wasn't the point, he told me. Impact was. I believed him. Looking back from that courtroom, I can see how neatly the foundation was laid. Silence was never demanded. It was encouraged, rewarded, framed as grace. Every time I chose not to speak, the room relaxed. Every time I let something pass, I was praised for being reasonable. By the time I noticed how often my voice was missing from decisions that affected me, the pattern was already established. Speaking up felt disruptive. Silence felt responsible. In the courtroom, they laughed because they thought I had given everything away. They believed the woman who once chose quiet over conflict would always do the same. They saw my lowered eyes and folded hands and mistook them for habit. They didn't understand that silence had never erased who I was. It had simply taught me how to wait. Even then, before betrayal had a name, before humiliation became public, the expectation was already there. I would be agreeable. I would be contained. I would not complicate things. And for a long time I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because I thought safety was something you preserved by staying quiet. The conversation happened at a dinner that was supposed to celebrate progress. Daniel's family had invited a small group of people to our house, the kind of evening filled with congratulations and careful optimism. Plates were cleared, wine refilled, and somewhere between dessert and coffee, Daniel's father leaned back and said it was time to talk about next steps. Daniel picked up the thread smoothly, as if they had already rehearsed it. He talked about growth, visibility, the importance of presenting a unified front. Then he turned to me with a look that was warm but expectant. There was something already decided in his eyes. He asked if I would consider stepping back from a role I had always occupied openly. Not stepping away entirely, he was careful to say. Just shifting into a position that was less visible, less complicated, more appropriate, given where things were headed. His mother nodded immediately, adding that it would protect me from unnecessary scrutiny. His father framed it as a strategic move, temporary, reversible. Everyone spoke as though the change were an upgrade, not a reduction. I noticed that no one asked whether I wanted this. Daniel assured me nothing would really change. My influence would remain. My input would still matter. This was about optics, he said, about keeping things clean and uncomplicated. The words were calm, reasonable, impossible to argue with without seeming difficult. I felt the familiar pressure of the room leaning toward agreement. I had learned by then how quickly silence smoothed edges, how easily a pause could be mistaken for consent. I searched Daniel's face for hesitation and found none. When I said yes, it was quiet. No dramatic announcement, no signature across a table. Just a nod and a soft agreement that dissolved the tension instantly. Relief moved through the room like a shared breath. They praised me right away. Daniel squeezed my hand. His mother smiled with unmistakable approval. Someone commented on how understanding I was. I absorbed it all as proof that I had done the right thing. The change was immediate, though no one acknowledged it directly. Invitations stopped coming to me first. Emails that once included my name began arriving addressed only to Daniel. Decisions were relayed after the fact, framed as updates rather than discussions. When I noticed my name missing from a public acknowledgement where it had always appeared before, Daniel told me it was an oversight. When it happened again, he said it wasn't worth worrying about. Recognition, he reminded me gently, had never been my motivation. He was right. It wasn't. But absence has a way of teaching you what presence once meant. His family adjusted their tone without realizing it. Conversations shifted from collaborative to instructive. They thanked me for being flexible, for not making things complicated. The phrase came up often enough that it began to sound rehearsed. Silence became a compliment. A colleague mentioned casually that she hadn't realized I was no longer involved in certain decisions. I laughed and said it was a temporary shift. Daniel had said the same thing. The words felt borrowed even as I spoke them. Later that night, alone, I wondered why no one had asked for terms, why there had been no discussion of timelines or boundaries. I brushed the thought aside. Trust doesn't negotiate, I told myself. Trust believes. The warning came from someone who knew me before I learned how to step back. A friend who had watched me build my career with precision and intention asked why I seemed smaller lately. I defended Daniel immediately. I explained the strategy, the optics, the bigger picture. She listened, unconvinced. "Just make sure you're choosing this," she said. "Not just agreeing to it." I assured her I was. I meant it at the time. What I didn't see then was how easily a pattern forms once expectations shift. I had given up the assumption that my input was required. That was the first thing to go, not a title or position, but the expectation of being consulted. After that, nothing had to be taken from me. I stepped aside willingly, believing I was making room for something shared. Believing silence was temporary. In the courtroom years later, they would point to this moment without naming it. They would say I had always been agreeable, always compliant. They would mistake adaptation for surrender. They never understood that what I gave up first was not power, but noise. And once silence became normal, it became enforceable. By the time I realized how much ground I had quietly ceded, the habit was already in place. Silence had become the default. Speaking up felt like disruption, like breaking an unspoken rule I had helped write. I didn't know then how expensive that first yes would become. I only knew that the room had relaxed when I agreed, and I had learned once again that peace came fastest when I stepped aside. The house began to feel different long before I understood why. Nothing dramatic changed. No arguments, no slammed doors. Just small adjustments that made me feel like a guest in rooms I had once moved through without thinking. Furniture shifted slightly, as if to accommodate conversations I wasn't part of. Doors closed more often. When I entered a room, voices lowered, then rose again once I sat quietly. I told myself I was imagining it. Stress does that, I thought. It makes you sensitive. Daniel started correcting me in ways that sounded reasonable enough to accept without protest. He suggested I choose better moments to bring things up. He advised me to soften my phrasing, to consider how certain comments might land. It wasn't criticism, he insisted. It was protection. Appearances mattered more now. When I stayed quiet during tense exchanges, he noticed immediately. He would thank me later, his tone warm with relief. He told me I handled things well, that I was steady, mature. The praise came quickly, faster than any real resolution ever had. Decisions inside our home began to follow a new pattern. Daniel would tell me what we had decided instead of asking what I thought. When I pointed it out gently, he seemed genuinely surprised. He said we had talked about it already. If I couldn't remember, maybe I'd been distracted. At first, I laughed it off. Everyone forgets things. But the doubt crept in quietly. I started questioning my own memory, replaying conversations in my head to see what I might have missed. It was easier to assume I was wrong than to accuse him of rewriting the past. His family became more present, their visits more frequent and less optional. They framed their involvement as concern, as guidance. They spoke to me like mediators, reminding me of tradition, of the importance of unity. Daniel never contradicted them. He let their voices fill the space where his might have been. Silence, I learned, was respectful. The first time I chose not to respond on purpose was over something small, a comment about a decision I had supposedly agreed to. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to correct the record. Instead, I stayed quiet. The moment passed instantly, the tension dissolved. Everyone relaxed, conversation flowing as if nothing had happened. Someone smiled at me, grateful. I felt invisible and applauded at the same time. That was when I understood that silence worked. The house grew quieter after that, not in sound, but in exchange. Fewer questions were directed at me. Fewer pauses waited for my input. Daniel began answering for me in public, anticipating what I would say and smoothing it into something more acceptable. I let him. Friends stopped calling as often, invitations slowed, then ceased. When I reached out, conversations felt cautious, filtered. I realized people were hearing about me instead of from me. Daniel had become my translator, my spokesperson, the authority on my own thoughts. He told me it was temporary. He always did. I noticed how often I adjusted myself to keep things calm, how quickly I learned which topics caused friction and which earned approval. I became skilled at reading the room, at anticipating reactions before they happened. Silence became less a choice than a reflex. There was no lock on the door, no command to stay quiet. Just a steady accumulation of moments where speaking felt heavier than staying still. One evening, after his parents had left, I stood in the kitchen looking at the space I had helped shape. Everything was familiar, yet it no longer felt like mine. Daniel moved easily around me, comfortable, assured. He asked if I was all right. I said yes. The word came out automatically, practiced. He smiled, relieved, and kissed my cheek before turning back to his phone. The conversation ended before it began. That night, lying awake beside him, I tried to trace when the shift had occurred. There was no single moment to point to. No line crossed openly. Just a gradual narrowing, a quiet agreement I had entered into without realizing its terms. Silence had not been forced on me. It had been offered as convenience, as peace, as proof that I was capable of handling things gracefully. By the time I recognized the cost, the habit was deeply rooted. Speaking up felt like an overreaction. Silence felt responsible. In the courtroom years later, they would look at my stillness and assume it was familiar, expected. They would believe I had always been this way, that I had nothing to say because I had never learned to speak. They never saw how carefully the silence had been taught, or how deliberately it had been learned. At home, that was where it began. Not with betrayal, not with cruelty, but with the quiet understanding that things went more smoothly when I stayed out of the way. And once that understanding settled in, it shaped everything that followed. I saw her for the first time in a room where I expected to feel invisible in a different way. It was a community reception tied to one of Daniel's family initiatives, the kind of event where familiarity passed for belonging. I arrived on time, alone as usual, and scanned the room for faces I recognized. Daniel was already there. He stood near the center, relaxed, engaged, his posture open in the way it had once been only with me. And beside him was a woman I had never met, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Not leaning in, not whispering, just comfortably positioned, as if she had always been there. I watched for reactions. Someone would correct this, I thought. Someone would shift, hesitate, acknowledge me. No one did. When Daniel noticed me, his smile tightened for half a second before smoothing into something polite. He did not come over immediately. The woman glanced at me, then away, as if checking off a detail already known. That was when it landed. I was the only one who hadn't been informed. They introduced her eventually, not to me, but to the group. Her name was said lightly, followed by a vague explanation. A friend. Someone who helps out. Someone involved. Daniel didn't look at me as he spoke. His family greeted her warmly, familiar, as though she had passed some unspoken threshold long ago. When someone finally gestured in my direction, it was almost an afterthought. "You know Daniel's wife," they said, as if I were a role rather than a person. The woman smiled then, a measured expression that held neither apology nor curiosity. She knew exactly who I was. The evening continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. Conversations flowed around me. Laughter rose and fell. I stood where I was placed and said very little. Each time I stayed quiet, the room seemed to relax, as though my silence were a signal that everything was under control. I understood then that my presence was being managed. Later, when I asked Daniel about her, I chose my words carefully. Not an accusation, not a confrontation. Just a question, quiet enough to leave him space to respond honestly. He didn't deny anything, he reframed it. He said things had evolved, that the situation was complicated, that bringing it up publicly would have embarrassed everyone. He criticized my timing, not his actions. He told me I was overthinking something that had already been handled. I listened, I nodded. I stayed calm. The relief on his face was immediate. He had prepared for anger and found silence instead. Whatever explanation he had rehearsed dissolved into confidence. The conversation ended quickly, efficiently, without resolution. His family stepped in soon after, not to defend him, but to manage me. They spoke in gentle tones about practicality, about legacy, about avoiding unnecessary disruption. My silence, they said, showed dignity, strength, grace under pressure. Someone thanked me for handling it so well. Her presence increased after that. She appeared at meetings tied to influence and planning, places where decisions were shaped long before they were announced. She spoke easily about the future, about adjustments and improvements, as if her role were permanent and understood. No one corrected her. She moved through spaces I had once navigated confidently, and no one questioned it. Not Daniel, not his family, not the people who had once sought my input. I watched her step into conversations that had previously included me, and felt the strange sensation of being replaced without ever being removed. The humiliation wasn't loud, it didn't come with arguments or raised voices. It came wrapped in politeness, in the expectation that I would continue to behave as I always had. Quiet, reasonable, uncomplicating. I realized then that asking questions only reassured them. Each attempt at clarification confirmed that I was still playing by the old rules. So I stopped. I didn't confront her. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't appeal to anyone's sense of fairness. I withdrew, deliberately, into the role they had already assigned me. They mistook it for defeat. Daniel grew more assured. The woman grew bolder. His family discussed plans openly in front of me, speaking as though my silence were agreement. I responded with neutrality, neither confirming nor denying anything. Inside, something shifted. Not anger, not despair, calculation. They believed the story was finished because I had stopped resisting. They assumed my quiet meant acceptance, that the narrative had settled into its final shape. They didn't see what my silence was doing. They didn't hear what I was listening for. That night, alone, I understood something I hadn't before. Silence had become useful to them because it made their choices easier. It also made their assumptions louder. And assumptions, I knew, could be dangerous. I lay awake thinking about how easily I had been written out of my own life without a single argument. How smoothly replacement could happen when everyone agreed not to acknowledge it. The cruelty wasn't personal, it was procedural. By morning, I had stopped asking myself why this was happening. That question had no value. What mattered was how thoroughly they believed I was finished. They had mistaken my quiet for compliance. They had mistaken patience for surrender. And in doing so, they had done something irreversible. They had stopped watching me. The woman who stood beside Daniel that night believed she had arrived at the end of the story. His family believed the same. They all did. I knew better. Because when people stop expecting resistance, they stop guarding their foundations. And from that moment on, every word I didn't say was no longer for their comfort. It was for my timing. I wasn't looking for anything when I saw it. That mattered to me later, when I replayed the moment over and over, trying to decide whether it had been curiosity or instinct that made me stop. Daniel had left his briefcase on the kitchen counter, unlatched, papers slightly fanned as if he'd meant to come back for it and hadn't. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I told myself to keep walking, to leave it exactly as it was. That was the rule now. Don't touch, don't question. I hesitated anyway. One page had slipped halfway out, the corner catching the light. My name was there. Not written the way it would be in a note or a letter, but embedded in dense formal language. The kind that doesn't exist to be read casually. The kind that assumes authority. I pulled it free and skimmed at first, not fully understanding what I was seeing. It wasn't dramatic. No shocking revelations. Just careful phrasing, deliberate exclusions, sentences built to hold up under scrutiny. My name appeared where I didn't expect it, and where I did expect it, it was missing. I slowed down. This wasn't a draft. There were signatures, dates. Finality pressed into the paper in a way that made my hands feel suddenly unsteady. I recognized the structure immediately. Not because I was a lawyer, but because I had worked closely enough with them to know how these things were shaped. This wasn't something thrown together in response to recent events. It had been planned. The more I read, the clearer it became. This document wasn't about me in the present. It was about me in the future. About control, authority, and what would happen if certain conditions were met. Conditions that depended on my continued cooperation. My continued silence. The woman's name appeared once, not prominently, but enough to matter. A role defined without emotion. A position waiting to be filled. I felt the pieces align with a quiet precision that took my breath away. The conversations. The decisions I hadn't been part of. The way my silence had been interpreted not as hesitation, but as consent. This document relied on the assumption that I wouldn't challenge it, that I wouldn't even notice. Silence, I realized, had legal consequences. I didn't finish reading standing there. I sat at the table and went through it carefully, line by line, until the picture was complete. This wasn't about betrayal alone. It was about erasure, about removing me cleanly, efficiently, without confrontation. A process disguised as inevitability. When I was done, I folded the paper exactly as I'd found it. I slid it back into the briefcase, adjusted the latch, and wiped the counter where my hands had rested. I left no trace. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood something fundamental had changed. Inside me. That night, Daniel talked easily about his day. He mentioned meetings, plans, future steps. He spoke with the confidence of someone whose path felt secure. I listened, nodded, asked nothing. My silence fit perfectly into the space he expected it to occupy. Over the next few days, I watched more closely. Not anxiously, methodically. Comments that had once seemed casual now sounded rehearsed. The woman spoke about timelines with an assurance that made sense now. His family referenced outcomes as if they were already settled. Each small observation confirmed what the document had outlined so neatly. I had been meant to disappear quietly. It struck me how much my earlier silence had enabled this moment. If I had argued more, if I had insisted on explanations, if I had demanded clarity, any of that would have triggered caution. Instead, my restraint had created comfort. Comfort breeds carelessness. I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't ask questions meant to trap him. I didn't reveal what I knew. I behaved exactly as I always had, calm, agreeable, unthreatening. Inside, I began to prepare. I didn't gather evidence the way people expect, with secret recordings or dramatic discoveries. I paid attention. I remembered dates, phrasing, who said what and when. I noticed how often the same assumptions surfaced, how rarely anyone checked whether they were accurate. Once, I verified a small detail with a clerk I'd known professionally for years, careful not to frame it as suspicion. Her response was brief, factual, and enough. She paused, then asked why that particular question mattered. I told her it probably didn't. She didn't look convinced. The window was narrowing. I could feel it. Each confident step Daniel took locked the situation further into place. Filings were prepared. Statements drafted. Everything moved forward under the assumption that the foundation was solid. They never checked it. The final confirmation came when Daniel mentioned, almost casually, that things would be simpler once everything was official. He smiled as he said it, certain of the ground beneath him, certain I was no longer part of the equation. That was the moment I knew there was no turning back for them. I chose silence again, but this time it wasn't reflex or accommodation. It was leverage. Every word I withheld preserved their certainty. Every question I didn't ask allowed them to proceed unchecked. They believed silence meant safety. They had no idea it had made me dangerous. By the time I went to bed that night, the fear I'd carried for so long was gone. In its place was something steadier. Not confidence, not hope. Clarity. They had built their plan on the assumption that I would remain quiet forever. They hadn't accounted for the difference between silence that is imposed and silence that is chosen. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. Somewhere down the hall, Daniel slept peacefully, unaware that the silence he depended on had shifted ownership. I wasn't broken, I wasn't lost, I wasn't unaware, I was waiting. And when silence becomes intentional, it stops being empty. It becomes weight. It becomes timing. It becomes the thing that holds everything else in place until the moment it no longer has to. I let myself look smaller. It wasn't difficult. All I had to do was stop compensating, stop smoothing edges, stop carrying conversations the way I always had. I lowered my eyes more often. I spoke only when spoken to. I left rooms early. The change was subtle enough to feel organic, and dramatic enough for them to notice. Daniel noticed first. His shoulders relaxed. The tight vigilance he'd carried for months melted into something like relief. He began finishing my sentences again, answering questions directed at me without checking whether I intended to speak. When I didn't correct him, his confidence grew. His family followed his lead. Their tone shifted from cautious to dismissive. They stopped weighing their words around me. They spoke freely, sometimes cruelly, assuming I was too fragile to understand or too defeated to respond. I let them believe it. The story they told about me solidified quickly. I heard it secondhand, filtered through acquaintances who thought they were being kind. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, not handling things well. Daniel was being patient. The situation was delicate. I didn't correct a single version. The more broken I appeared, the safer they felt. Conversations resumed around me as if I were furniture. Plans were discussed openly. Assumptions went unchallenged. I learned more by being ignored than I ever had by being involved. Silence gave me access. I listened to the way Daniel spoke about timelines when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I noted the phrases his family repeated, the ones they had clearly agreed upon in advance. I watched how the woman positioned herself, not emotionally, but strategically, stepping into spaces that mattered while maintaining plausible deniability. I didn't interrupt. I remembered. There was someone else who noticed the shift, though she didn't know what to call it. A junior associate who had once deferred to me instinctively now hesitated, glancing between Daniel and me before speaking. When our eyes met, she looked away, uncomfortable. I didn't press her. I didn't ask questions that would force her to choose sides. I simply made space. A quiet nod here, a neutral acknowledgement there. Trust grows faster when it isn't demanded. Information came to me sideways after that. Offhand comments, incomplete sentences, a pause too long before a reassurance. I gathered fragments, not documents, patterns, not proof. I didn't need anything dramatic. I needed consistency. Daniel mistook my restraint for resignation. He began speaking about my future as if it were already decided. Smaller accommodations, temporary arrangements that would become permanent. He spoke gently, as though I were recovering from something unnamed. I nodded. The woman grew bolder. She stopped pretending her presence was incidental. She referenced plans she wasn't supposed to know yet. She laughed too easily, confident that there would be no consequences. She had mistaken my quiet for absence. His family stopped hiding their impatience. They talked around me, over me, through me. They debated logistics as if I weren't sitting there. I felt the sting, but I didn't react. Reaction would have reset their caution. I needed them careless. I made myself useful in small, non-threatening ways. I volunteered to handle errands no one cared about. I stayed out of meetings that mattered. I accepted the narrative they built around me because it made them predictable. At night, alone, the weight of it pressed hard. There were moments when the performance felt too convincing, when I wondered whether I was disappearing for real. I grounded myself in details, dates, words, the exact order of events. Reality has a way of holding you steady if you pay attention. Daniel's confidence turned sharp. He stopped moderating his tone. He spoke about me with the assumption that I would not object. He planned without accounting for me at all. That was the confirmation I needed. Broken people are underestimated. Underestimated people are dangerous. I committed fully then. No outbursts, no clarifications, no warnings. I kept my silence clean and consistent. The illusion had to hold until the moment it mattered most. They never questioned why I stopped asking questions. They never wondered why I no longer tried to explain myself. They took my quiet as acceptance, as proof that the story they were telling had settled into its final shape. They couldn't see what I was building because I wasn't building anything visible. When Daniel finally told me that paperwork would be filed soon, his voice was almost kind. He framed it as mercy, as resolution. He watched my face closely, waiting for a reaction. I gave him none. He smiled then, satisfied, and reached for his phone. The conversation ended as he expected it to. Clean, controlled, one-sided. As I turned away, I felt something steady beneath the calm. Not rage, not fear, certainty. When people stop expecting resistance, they stop guarding their foundations. They forget to double-check. They assume silence means agreement instead of calculation. I let them keep believing it. By the time they realized I had been listening all along, the shape of the outcome would already be fixed. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no shouted truth. Just a quiet moment when the ground shifted beneath them, and they understood too late that my silence had never been empty. It had been deliberate, and it had been patient. The envelope was thicker than I expected, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with paper. Daniel handed it to me as if he were passing along a receipt, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "You'll want to look at this," he said. "It's better this way." I took it without comment. I didn't open it right away. I stood there, feeling the weight of it in my hands, noticing how quickly the room settled when I didn't react. The woman watched me from the doorway, her expression sharp with curiosity, then relief when I remained quiet. Daniel mistook my stillness for shock. He was wrong. Inside were the filings, clean, confident, written to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know what had been omitted. They framed the situation as orderly, inevitable, already resolved. My silence appeared everywhere, translated into consent, into compliance, into absence. It was built into the structure of the offer like an assumption no one thought to challenge. Daniel explained the terms out loud, simplifying them into something almost generous. Temporary arrangements, reasonable restrictions, a suggestion that I not complicate things by involving anyone else. He spoke gently, as though guiding me through something delicate. The woman nodded along, careful not to look pleased, failing anyway. His family reinforced the message later that day. This was for the best. Everyone would be spared unnecessary stress. I was advised to rest, to take care of myself, to let them handle the details. They all expected fear. I gave them nothing. When Daniel asked if I had questions, I shook my head. The answer came easily. Questions would have slowed things down. I needed them to move exactly as they planned. The next few days unfolded with a strange efficiency. Appointments were scheduled without consulting me. Conversations happened around me, not with me. I attended an initial legal meeting where my presence was noted more than my participation. My silence was recorded as a lack of opposition. It was official now. I watched how quickly filing first transformed their behavior. Daniel spoke as though the outcome were sealed. The woman stopped pretending to stay on the edges. His family discussed logistics openly, already rearranging their expectations to suit a future they believed was guaranteed. I listened. The filings assumed I would not seek outside counsel. They relied on my continued quiet to remain intact. Each page was written with confidence that I would accept what was offered because I always had. They mistook my history of restraint for predictability. I didn't correct them. At night, I read the documents carefully, not to argue with them, but to understand how completely they depended on my silence. Certain provisions only functioned if unchallenged. Certain timelines collapsed under scrutiny. They had rushed to file, believing speed was power. They never considered what speed exposes. When Daniel asked again if I was all right, I said yes. The word smoothed the edges of his concern and allowed him to move on. He began speaking about practicalities, about making things easier for everyone involved, about moving forward. He thought filing had ended the story. I felt a calm settle over me that surprised even myself. Not relief, Not resignation, precision. Everything was now in the open, fixed to a date, a record, a sequence of steps that could not be undone without consequence. Their certainty had locked them into place. That was what I needed. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I didn't explain myself to anyone. I allowed the narrative to proceed untouched, each assumption stacking neatly on the last. My silence became part of the record, a detail no one questioned because it fit the version of me they had already accepted. I chose the terrain of this fight by refusing to engage where they expected me to. Daniel mistook my calm for defeat. He mistook the absence of protest for agreement. He mistook my silence for fear. The woman mistook it for victory. His family mistook it for relief. They all missed the same thing. Filing first didn't give them control. It fixed their position. It committed them to a structure built on assumptions they had never checked. It made their confidence visible and their mistakes permanent. When the date for the hearing was set, Daniel told me as if delivering good news. He said it would be quick, procedural, a formality. He watched my face, waiting for something he could respond to. I gave him nothing. He smiled, satisfied, and walked away to make another call. The woman followed him, already discussing what would come next. His family began planning openly, certain the hard part was over. I stood alone in the room for a moment, the envelope resting on the table where he had left it. The house was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different, not imposed, not negotiated, chosen. They thought filing ended the story because they believed silence was the last thing I had left to offer. They believed I would remain where they placed me, contained by the very restraint they had trained me to practice. They never understood that silence can be a position, that once something is written into the record, it can be used. They thought filing meant winning. I knew it meant timing. They all shared the same assumption, though none of them ever said it out loud. They believed I had nothing left, that whatever mattered had already been signed away, softened by my silence, sealed by their speed. It showed in the way Daniel moved through the days after filing. He spoke freely now, casually referencing outcomes as if they were already behind us. He stopped watching his words around me. The woman stopped pretending to be careful. His family treated the situation like an inconvenience that was nearly resolved. Their certainty filled every room. What they never checked was the foundation of that certainty. I found the detail by accident, the same way I'd found the document weeks earlier. Not through digging, not through suspicion, but through familiarity. I had spent years working adjacent to contracts, agreements, and governance structures. I knew how things were supposed to align, and I knew when something didn't. There was a clause buried deep in the structure of what they'd filed, not highlighted, not explained. It was the kind of provision most people skim past because it looks procedural, harmless, irrelevant. It governed authority, timing, standing, and it depended on a condition they assumed had already been satisfied. It hadn't. The oversight was subtle, but devastating. Without meeting that condition, their filing didn't do what they thought it did. It shifted jurisdiction. It limited power. It altered who had the right to act and when. Everything they believed was locked in place was in fact provisional. They had moved too fast. I understood immediately why no one had caught it. The clause wasn't designed for someone like me to notice. It relied on the assumption that I wouldn't read closely, that I wouldn't understand the implications, that I wouldn't question something so technical. My silence had made that assumption feel safe. If I had spoken earlier, asked questions, demanded explanations, they would have slowed down, rechecked, adjusted. Instead, my quiet had encouraged them to proceed unchecked, straight into a structure that couldn't support their weight. I needed confirmation, not reassurance. I didn't call a dramatic meeting or demand an opinion. I reached out quietly to someone whose job involved maintaining records most people forgot existed. I framed my question carefully, as a hypothetical, a clarification, something that didn't carry urgency. There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to matter. "That hasn't been addressed," she said finally. Her tone was neutral, professional. Then, after a moment, "Why do you ask?" I told her it probably didn't matter, that I was just double-checking something for my own understanding. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was different, still calm, but alert. "You might want to make sure that's clarified before anything proceeds." I thanked her and ended the call. That was all I needed. From that point on, preparation became an exercise in restraint. I gathered what was necessary, nothing more: copies, references, clear markers that showed exactly where their confidence had outpaced their diligence. I didn't alert Daniel. I didn't hint at anything. I let their timeline move forward untouched. Every step they took reinforced the oversight. Daniel made a public comment about closure, confident enough to assume no one would question him. His family repeated it. The woman spoke openly about what would happen next, already arranging her place in a future she believed was secured. Each word locked them further into position. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had mistaken my silence for ignorance, when it had been the very thing that preserved their blind spot. If I had argued more, if I had resisted openly, if I had made noise, none of this would have been possible. The final misstep came days before the hearing. Daniel authorized something he shouldn't have, based on authority he didn't actually hold. It was a small action, routine, almost forgettable, but it depended entirely on the assumption that the filing had done what he believed it had. It hadn't. That single move sealed everything. There was no way to undo it without exposing the flaw, no way to correct course without acknowledging the mistake. The structure they had built was now dependent on a foundation that didn't exist. I felt no rush of triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that the outcome was no longer a matter of persuasion or emotion. It was procedural, mathematical. I had stepped aside long enough for them to entangle themselves completely. They continued to mock my silence without realizing how precisely it had positioned me. They believed quiet meant passive. That absence of objection meant absence of leverage. They never understood that leverage doesn't announce itself. It waits. The night before the hearing, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I believed everything would be easy, but because there was nothing left to guess. The variables were fixed. The record was set. They would walk into that courtroom believing they owned it, believing the story was already written, believing I would sit exactly where they had placed me. They were right about one thing. I would be silent. But not for the reasons they thought. They had built their case on unchecked assumptions, and assumptions, once exposed, collapse all at once. They never checked because they never imagined they needed to. They believed my silence was empty. They had no idea it was structural. By the time the judge began reading, by the time the room shifted and confusion replaced confidence, it would already be too late to fix what they had failed to verify. They mocked my silence because they thought it meant I had nothing. They never checked the ground beneath their feet. The courthouse looked the same as it always had, solid and indifferent, but I noticed every detail as I walked through the doors. The echo of footsteps on stone, the muted conversations drifting through security, the way people carried themselves when they believed the law was about to confirm what they already felt entitled to. I felt calm, not numb, not detached, calm in the way that comes when there is nothing left to improvise. Daniel arrived minutes after I did, his confidence unmistakable. He moved easily, greeting familiar faces, exchanging brief nods with people who treated this like a routine obligation. The woman followed a step behind him, composed and polished, dressed as if she were attending a closing ceremony rather than a hearing. His family trailed them, united and certain, already behaving like spectators at the end of a long process. No one looked at me for long. They took their seats with the assurance of people who believed the room belonged to them. Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms, murmuring something to his attorney that made him smile. The woman adjusted herself, glancing around as if measuring the space she assumed she would soon occupy more freely. I sat exactly where I had been told to sit, hands folded, posture still. I did not carry a stack of papers or whisper urgently to anyone. From the outside, I looked as unprepared as they expected me to be. That assumption settled in quickly. Daniel's attorney spoke first, his tone smooth and efficient. He laid out their position as though it were already established fact. He referenced my lack of opposition, my cooperation, my silence. He framed it as evidence of agreement, of understanding, of acceptance. No one interrupted him. As he spoke, I watched the judge, not her face, which remained unreadable, but the small movements most people overlook. The way she held her pen, the slight pause when she reached a particular section of the file, the quiet marking in the margin before she turned the page. Daniel didn't notice any of it. The attorney concluded with confidence, his final words carrying the satisfaction of someone who believes the hard part is done. Daniel straightened, ready for confirmation. The woman's mouth curved into a restrained smile. His family leaned back, relieved. I did not move. When it was my turn, my attorney stood briefly and submitted the documents we had prepared. No argument, no speech, just the formal acknowledgement that something had been entered into the record. Daniel's attorney barely glanced at it. The judge did. She read without expression, her attention narrowing. She turned a page back, then forward again. The room shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, like air pressure changing before a storm. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his confidence flickering into confusion. The judge did not speak yet. She made a note. Then another. She removed her glasses and rested them on the file, a small gesture that carried more weight than any objection. Daniel's attorney cleared his throat, prepared to elaborate, but she raised a hand without looking at him. Silence settled again. This time, it wasn't mine. The woman beside Daniel stiffened, her gaze darting between him and the bench. His family grew quieter, the easy familiarity draining from their posture. Daniel frowned, glancing at his attorney, then back at the judge, searching for cues that weren't there. The judge returned her attention to the documents, reading one page more carefully than the rest. I knew that page. I knew exactly what she was seeing. No one else did. When she finally looked up, her gaze swept the room slowly, deliberately, as if recalibrating the balance of the space. Daniel straightened fully now, bracing for a response that would restore his certainty. His attorney prepared to speak again. She didn't let him. Instead, she asked a question. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just precise. A clarification that should have been simple to answer if their assumptions were correct. Daniel's attorney hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. A pause too long to go unnoticed. He began responding, then stopped, recalculating. The woman's expression tightened. Daniel's confidence faltered, replaced by something brittle. The judge listened, her face unchanged. When the attorney finished, she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She glanced down again, confirming something already decided. I felt the shift then, fully, like the floor tilting beneath people who hadn't realized they were standing on an edge. Daniel sensed it too. His foot tapped once against the floor, then stilled. The room no longer felt familiar to him. The judge announced a brief recess. Daniel exhaled, forcing a smile, whispering reassurances to the woman and his family. "It's procedural," he said, too quickly. "Nothing to worry about." His attorney nodded, though his attention was elsewhere now, focused inward, recalculating. I remained seated. I didn't check my phone, I didn't look around. I didn't engage in the quiet conversations buzzing behind me. I knew what the pause meant. It wasn't for them. It was for the record. When the judge returned, the room stood automatically. The formality felt heavier now, charged with uncertainty. Daniel's confidence did not return with her. It stayed behind, somewhere in the recess, unrecovered. She took her seat and opened the file again. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of vindication, only clarity. The courtroom they thought they owned no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the process now, to the rules they had assumed would work only in their favor. They were still waiting for a speech, for an argument, for me to say something. They didn't understand that everything that needed to be said was already on the page. The judge looked up, ready to speak. And for the first time since this had begun, Daniel looked afraid. The judge returned to the bench with the same calm expression she had worn all morning, but something in the room had shifted while she was gone. Daniel felt it before he understood it. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering quickly, his confidence now edged with impatience. The woman beside him adjusted her posture, smoothing her jacket as if control could be pressed back into place. I stayed exactly as I was. The judge didn't summarize. She didn't revisit arguments or restate positions. She opened the file and turned directly to the section marked with her pen, as though everything before it were already settled. Her voice was even, almost conversational. There was no drama in the way she spoke, no emphasis meant to punish or impress. Just a single sentence, delivered with the precision of someone stating a fact rather than an opinion. It was short, clean, legally airtight. The effect was immediate. Daniel blinked once, then again, as if the words hadn't quite reached him. His attorney stiffened, eyes dropping to the documents in front of him, flipping a page back with sudden urgency. The woman's smile disappeared entirely. She looked from Daniel to his attorney, searching for reassurance that didn't come. The judge paused, allowing the sentence to settle, then continued in the same measured tone. She explained what that sentence meant, how it affected authority, how it altered standing, how the filing they relied on did not in fact give them the control they believed it did. Daniel's attorney rose halfway out of his chair. "Your Honor," she raised a hand, stopping him without lifting her voice. "You may sit." The silence that followed was different from any I had experienced before. It wasn't charged with tension or expectation. It was final. Daniel finally seemed to understand. His face drained of color, the certainty he had carried for months collapsing into something naked and unsteady. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, unsure of where to begin. The judge continued, outlining the immediate consequences. Orders were issued, limitations imposed. The structure Daniel had rushed into place unraveled methodically, each thread pulled loose by procedure rather than emotion. The woman's hands trembled slightly in her lap. She glanced toward Daniel's family, who were whispering urgently now, their earlier confidence replaced by sharp, frantic calculation. They had built their expectations on his assurance. Now that assurance was gone. Daniel's attorney attempted to recover, requesting clarification, time, reconsideration. The judge listened, then denied each request calmly, citing the same point again and again. The one sentence they had failed to account for. I never looked at them. I didn't need to see their reactions to know what was happening. The room itself told me. The way bodies leaned inward, the way breath caught, the way power drained quietly, without spectacle. The judge concluded the hearing with a final remark, procedural and firm. The gavel struck once, sharp and definitive. Court was adjourned. For a moment, no one moved. Daniel stared ahead, as if the space in front of him might rearrange itself into something familiar. The woman stood abruptly, then hesitated, unsure whether she was supposed to leave with him or follow his attorney. His family gathered their things with shaking hands, dignity slipping despite their efforts to contain it. I stood when instructed, gathered my belongings, and turned toward the exit. Daniel called my name then, his voice cracking in a way I barely recognized. I didn't stop. The sound faded behind me, swallowed by the shuffle of feet and the murmur of conversations restarting around us. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter, as though pressure had been released from a sealed space. My attorney touched my arm briefly, a quiet acknowledgement that everything that could be done had been done. I nodded and stepped away. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, no thrill, just a deep, steady sense of rightness. I had never raised my voice. I had never argued my worth aloud, and yet everything Daniel had relied on had been dismantled in front of him. They had mocked my silence because they believed it meant weakness. They had laughed because they thought words were the only currency that mattered. They never understood that silence, when chosen carefully, carries weight of its own. The sentence the judge spoke would be quoted in filings and records. It would be analyzed and explained by people who cared about precedent and procedure. For Daniel, it would always mean the moment his certainty failed him. For me, it meant something simpler. I hadn't been invisible. I hadn't been absent. I had been waiting for the right voice to speak. And when it did, there was nothing left for me to say. I walked out of the courthouse alone, not because no one followed, but because I didn't wait. The hallway felt longer than it had that morning, the echo of my steps steady and unhurried. Behind me, voices rose and tangled, urgent and confused, but none of them reached for me anymore. Outside, the air was cool and ordinary. Cars passed. Someone laughed on the sidewalk across the street. The world hadn't shifted the way it feels like it should after something monumental happens. And yet, something inside me had settled into place. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly. There were delays, revisions, sudden hesitations where certainty had once lived. People who had spoken confidently began choosing their words more carefully. Doors that had closed to me reopened, not out of kindness but necessity. I didn't chase any of it. Daniel tried to contact me once, then twice. Messages softened with each attempt. Confidence replaced by confusion. Then something like regret. I never responded. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone who had only listened when I was silent. The woman disappeared from conversations almost immediately. Her name stopped being mentioned. Plans that had included her were quietly adjusted, as though she had never been part of them at all. Watching that happen taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. Replacement only feels permanent until the structure supporting it collapses. I spent time reclaiming small things. Not assets or status, but pieces of myself I had set down without realizing it. I returned calls I had stopped making. I sat in rooms where I had once minimized myself and spoke when I wanted to, not when it was convenient. Some people apologized. Some avoided me entirely. Both reactions told me what I needed to know. There were moments of grief, too. Not for the marriage itself, but for the years I had spent believing silence was the only way to preserve peace. I let myself feel that without judgment. Healing doesn't come from pretending nothing hurt. What surprised me most was how light my voice felt when I finally used it again. Not louder, clearer, unburdened by the need to justify my presence. I thought often about that courtroom, about how easily silence is misread, especially when it comes from a woman. How quickly people assume quiet means agreement, weakness, or fear. They rarely consider intention. Silence can be imposed. It can be trained. But it can also be chosen. There is a difference between having your voice taken from you and deciding when it is worth using. I had lived on both sides of that line, and I knew now which one held power. Justice didn't arrive with applause or celebration. It arrived with procedure, with patience, with a sentence spoken by someone who had no stake in my emotions. That was enough. I didn't win because I outshouted anyone. I won because I understood the rules better than the people who thought they owned them. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, I want you to hear something clearly. Being quiet doesn't mean you are invisible. Being patient doesn't mean you are powerless. And being underestimated can become an advantage if you stop trying to correct it too soon. There are moments when speaking is necessary, and there are moments when waiting changes everything. I learned to tell the difference. Today my life is smaller in some ways and larger in others. I choose where I show up. I choose when I speak, and I no longer confuse peace with erasure. If you've ever been talked over, dismissed, or made to feel like your silence defined your worth, you're not alone. I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Share what standing your ground looked like for you, even if it happened quietly. If this story resonated with you, please like it so others can find it too. And if you want to stay for more stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of revenge that doesn't require raising your voice, consider subscribing to the channel. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one you choose to use last.